Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Deputy Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week, we're talking about some new and alarming threats to healthcare for those in the LGBTQIA+ community. Joining me in the studio is Kat Grant, our Equal Justice Works Fellow. Hello, Kat.
Hello, always happy to be here.
And as always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we're discussing today. So please leave your questions in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show. So in the wake of this extremely problematic Supreme Court term that has just wrapped up, we've learned that the justice's next term will be deciding a case that could change the future of medical care for transgender youth in America. Like I said, these cases we've talked about over many months. You and I have sat on this in this studio before and talked about how these challenges have been percolating their way through the lower courts. Activists and anti-trans forces everywhere have been filing lawsuits against or have
passing legislation. And then the people affected by it, as in this case, filing lawsuits. So
exactly.
Last month, the Supreme Court announced it will be deciding whether or not Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for minors violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. So that ban on gender-affirming care is very, very similar to bans in 24 other states because they were all written by the same group of Christian nationalist organizations, such as the Alliance Defending Freedom. So we deal with the Alliance Defending Freedom all the time. These are very, very common adversaries, shall we say, to FFRF, and a lot of these groups that were behind these bans are also the groups behind Project 2025.
Right.
So this ban in particular focuses on hormone replacement therapy, puberty blockers, and it also does ban gender-affirming surgery. So for minors, that is what's called top surgery. So that is either a breast reduction or a breast implant surgery. Mm-hmm. Minors almost never, if pretty much never, I don't want to use an absolute because somewhere out there someone will find a case of like a 17-year-old getting what's called bottom surgery, but almost never do minors actually get bottom surgery, even though that is banned in this bill as well. It's important to note that this ban only applies to trans children. It only applies to youth that have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. I believe the phrasing is something along the lines of these treatments for the purposes of allowing a child to identify as or live as a gender that is not the one that they were assigned at birth.
Right. And that's important because when we're talking about challenges to these bans, a big constitutional basis for those challenges is equal protection. And we're talking about governments that are banning procedures, but only for trans youth. They're not banned even for use on youth in other circumstances. So there are other reasons besides gender dysphoria that a physician might prescribe puberty blockers, for example. And those uses are A-OK and not illegal, but what is banned is using the same treatments to treat gender dysphoria. So again, this is a concerted effort by these far-right Christian legal organizations, Christian nationalist organizations like ADF, that are enacting, wholesale programs of legislation in order to affect or put into place this ideology that is all about, anti-abortion, anti-trans. It's, putting back into government or back into our laws, right? That marriage is between one man and one woman and everyone's hetero.
Traditional gender roles.
Exactly.
I think it is very important to note when we're talking about this, that this is about traditional gender roles. There is a reason why these treatments are still allowed for intersex children. Intersex children, when they're born, a lot of times are given genital surgeries that have all of these impacts that, these laws that are banning it for trans children are claiming that they're there to prevent, it causes fertility issues. It causes sexual issues in the future. And these children, who are usually under the age of 2, absolutely cannot consent to this. And you see puberty blockers being made available for precocious puberty. You see things like HRT being assigned or being prescribed to people under the age of 18 when their hormone levels are off. Even for cosmetic reasons, people under the age of 18 with informed consent and parental consent can get breast reductions, can get breast implants. Cis boys with gynecomastia can get what is essentially top surgery. So I think understanding that is very clear, because it is not about safety. We know that while there are risks, the risks of gender-affirming care are no different than any other type of medication. Antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, antibiotics all have risks. And we don't see these medications getting banned. These medications are safe. We've been using them for youth since the 90s, since before I was born, so nearly 30 years at this point. It is about fully forcing youth to conform to gender standards, because they think that if they force kids to identify as the sex they were assigned at birth, that they will no longer be trans. This is about eliminating transness, not about, making sure that kids are mature enough to make these types of choices.
Right, 100%. And so this ban, like you said, Kat, is the ban that's the subject of this lawsuit is the Tennessee ban, but we have seen many bans that are written exactly like this one pass a lot of legislatures across the country, and at an alarming rate. Right, in the past 5 years, we've seen this go from unheard of to like the top priority for conservative state legislatures across the country.
And we have seen that in the courts, these types of bans, and I'm talking about these bans very broadly, because they're very similar. Again, as I noted earlier, they're pretty much identical across the board, because they were all written by these same Christian nationalist organizations. They're not doing well in the courts. We have Trump-appointed judges, saying, like, in their decisions outright, gender identity exists. These laws are not being passed for a legitimate reason. They are being passed out of animus. So we are seeing that even very conservative judges are looking at bans such as the Tennessee ban and saying, hang on a minute. No, this is not valid. This is weird animus. And so we are seeing this going up to the Supreme Court with this particular case. I'm sure if not the last time I was on this show, one of the very recent times I was on this show, I predicted that we were probably going to see gender-affirming care in this upcoming term. So no one is really surprised. But what is interesting is that, at least in my mind, and Liz, you might have a different opinion, this is a pretty open and shut equal protection case. This is a pretty open and shut sex discrimination case. They are making a certain type of health care used for the same reasons contingent on someone's birth sex.
Yes.
And to me, that follows Bostock. That follows the employment discrimination case that said that you can't discriminate against trans people for being trans on the basis of sex discrimination.
Yeah, I agree with that analysis 100%. I am not confident in this court's ability to reach a different ends somehow and find the means, because again, on these Christian nationalist, like, culture war priorities, we have seen this court time and time again get with that program and just kind of rationalize their way there, no matter what the case law suggests. I'm keeping an open mind, because I do think this was an appeal that is being sought by the affected trans youth, right? So in other words, the court below, the Sixth Circuit, is the court that basically upheld the gender-affirming care ban against
the Supreme Court could have just denied cert and let the ban go into effect.
Exactly. So they're taking this case from that posture. So you can read into that whatever you want. I mean, that's no that's no guarantee. But I do think that there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of what this court will do. And you can be sure it is whatever they want, regardless of the case law. So that's the part that is really troubling. And again, it is a very ideological court. Their ideology is very in line with the Christian nationalist legal movement. And so it remains to be seen what we can expect from gender-affirming care bans at this Supreme Court. It tracks in my mind. It's very different because of the sex discrimination piece and the body of case law that exists around sex discrimination when it comes to anti-LGBT action and laws. But I do think it tracks pretty, in my mind, the sort of analysis of Roe and abortion bans and how this court views the government's power to outright ban safe procedures that are medically indicated that they don't agree with on an ideological basis. And so I do think there's a non-zero chance that the court finds a way to allow Tennessee or, leave it to the states.
Yeah, I think it will very much be a leave it to the states type of situation. And as you can see, I believe that there's a map up currently. These bans are in effect in half of the United States.
Yeah.
And while this affects a very small number of children, this affects a very vulnerable group of children. I cannot emphasize enough that this is life-saving medical care that is being denied on the basis of a religious understanding of gender. That is why we so heavily cover these LGBT issues that sometimes people don't always understand why we're covering it. But this is why. It is because this is a theological understanding of gender being pushed. This is a proxy war for Christian nationalism. And we see this with other types of LGBT healthcare as well, like access to HIV preventative medications.
Yes. Speaking of which, we wanted to cover another threat that was a little under the radar, I think, in terms of the lawsuit and the litigation that has bubbled up around the HIV preventive drug PrEP. So we're going to talk about this federal appeals court ruling in New Orleans, which held that 8 particular employers do not have to cover certain types of preventative health care through their employer-paid insurance. And it all involves HIV prevention, drugs, and cancer screenings, and only for HIV vulnerable populations. And the employers are citing their own religious freedom, their own free exercise, religious freedom interests under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as the basis for why they don't want to cover in their insurance as employers employees who would otherwise be entitled to coverage under the Affordable Care Act for their HIV prevention treatments.
Right. And if this seems familiar, it's Hobby Lobby.
Yep.
It is the Hobby Lobby birth control decision once again. For those who are unfamiliar with PrEP, PrEP is an incredibly important medication. PrEP is a huge reason why the HIV/AIDS crisis is radically different to what it was. I mean, truly you can tell the generational difference amongst LGBT people versus basically just based on how many people you know who died of AIDS. There's that famous headline that's, no obituaries from a gay newspaper in San Francisco, where in the peak of the AIDS crisis, there was finally a day with no obituaries. We have lost an entire generation of mostly gay men from the AIDS crisis. And PrEP now, so many of my friends are on PrEP. It is a massive life-saving medication. And this 3-judge panel ruled that the coverage mandate under the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional because it came from something called the United States Preventative Services Task Force. So those members of that task force are not nominated by the president, and they are not confirmed by the Senate. They are what's called an independent administrative regulatory agency.
And they are part of the administrative state that we've heard so much about this Supreme Court term, right? So we're not covering it today, and it's sort of ancillary to what we're talking about, but in the Supreme Court's most recent term, you may have heard us talk about in other areas, we've blogged about it and probably talked about it on this show, a case overturning the Chevron deference doctrine, which involves basically the deference that our federal courts are supposed to show to subject matter experts within our federal agencies who are doing this important work of regulating products, regulating the safety of medications, deciding which medications are really effective as preventive measures. That's what this task force does. And grading them so that insurance companies understand which types of preventive measures they must cover under the ACA because of how effective they are. PrEP falls into that category.
And the reason that these agencies exist and are not appointed by the president or not confirmed by the Senate is because they are so important that they need to be kept out of the political sphere. Their work should not be dependent on who is in office.
Right.
So that
they're non-political, but very important government regulatory positions.
Right. And I think it's also important with this case to take a step back for a minute and note kind of how this is different from the Hobby Lobby case, because I think on its face you look at it and you say, this is Hobby Lobby 2. There's not going to be anything we can do. They're going to say, you know, these religious employers are saying that it promotes conduct that is against their religious beliefs. Basically, they believe it promotes homosexual conduct. It is important to note that actually we are at the first point in history since the start of the AIDS crisis that the amount of heterosexual people with HIV/AIDS actually outnumbers the amount of homosexual people. However, for those who remember the Reagan era, you know, there were people saying, and people in the government outright saying that, you know, AIDS was God's punishment for homosexuality. So while it is not, you know, the gay cancer, the gay disease, you know, what people used to call it, there is still that heavy connotation. But because HIV/AIDS can be passed through any number of things, I think many people remember Ryan White, who got it through a blood transfusion, or people can get it through, you know, they can get it as babies because their mother had HIV/AIDS. I think that is a very important aspect of this, where it could be conduct completely unrelated to this religious objection. And I think that that's, you know, if I were litigating this case, that is the difference I would really hone in on, because this medication is so critically vital.
It is literally like a, you know, secular miracle in terms of like addressing and turning around a plague, essentially.
Yes.
And so it's preventive. It's not, you know, this is finally something that can be done to prevent the catastrophic disease that is HIV. So, and that's, of course, the conclusion of the task force that graded this drug in a way that makes it mandatory to be covered by insurance under the ACA. This case was a federal court case that had this sort of bad decision that went up to the Fifth Circuit, which upheld this interpretation.
Right.
And so this is a Fifth Circuit opinion that only applies to the employers that are actually party to the case.
But it is now going back down to the district court to be redecided with this interpretation that the mandate is unconstitutional.
So it wouldn't be surprising if this case itself also found its way to the Supreme Court.
Right.
That seems very likely, although it'll take a while because, again, it's going back down to the district court for further proceedings.
Right. I would definitely be looking at the term about 2 years from now to see where this goes. And unfortunately, I do not see a great outcome. You know, if I'm reading tea leaves, I don't see the best outcome, but sometimes we get surprises.
Yeah.
So
I do see it as very closely hewed to the Hobby Lobby decision. It involves the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, which is the basis for these religious freedom claims that are being made by the employers, same as Hobby Lobby. And in Hobby Lobby, the issue, you remember, the drug that promotes ungodly conduct was birth control.
Yeah.
Also famously prescribed for all kinds of reasons besides promiscuous sex, non-procreative variety. But of course, was of no moment to the court back then, which was not even as conservative as the court we have today, and not necessarily as Christian nationalist and ideological. Add to that all of the dismantling of the deference that courts are supposed to show to the administrative action of agencies, and I think it doesn't bode well for, or it bodes very well for Christian nationalist employers who want to deny their employees life-saving medications, but it doesn't bode well for a lot of these mandates and insurance mandates and administrative regulations that are protecting all the rest of us who are covered by employer-paid insurance.
And of course, even if the mandate is upheld, there are still major threats to access to things like birth control, PrEP, gender-affirming care, all of these types of health care that are really dependent on, at this point, what religious beliefs are in the healthcare system, especially when you consider that Catholic hospitals are eating up every single hospital system in the United States.
Right. So that is the third threat we wanted to kind of raise the awareness on this episode. And we've talked about this on past episodes, but it's a problem that is just continuing apace, which is that the Catholic health system, right, the Catholic health conglomerate has become really pervasive. And in some parts of the country, there are so many hospital systems that have been absorbed or bought by Catholic healthcare systems that there are so many kind of like secular healthcare deserts, basically, places in the country where the only care you can get, the only medical care you can get, is dictated by the American Conference of Catholic Bishops, right?
Right.
Like, you can only get care at a Catholic hospital, and the care that they offer is dictated by the tenets of the Catholic Church and the Catholic Bishops' Conference.
Right. And if you want to know how this actually, like, really in detail, how all of this happens, I wrote a blog last year, back in August, titled "Healthcare Decisions Should Be Made by Doctors and Patients, Not Priests." And in researching this, I went through a lot of Vatican documents. I went through, a lot of the process as to how the Catholic hierarchy in the United States is able to put down these decisions. This was specifically about gender-affirming care, even though no one on the committee that makes these decisions and puts them down to the American Catholic hospital system is a doctor. All of them are priests, all of them are bishops, and it's usually very much to the opposition of people who are doctors in the Catholic healthcare system, to people who run major Catholic healthcare hospital associations, and to people in religious life. We saw groups like the Sisters of Providence, who I always give a shout out to because I grew up around them and they are very cool, but the Sisters of Providence out in Terre Haute, they led up a group of a ton of sisters religious who said, hey, this is bad, this is wrong, and also we need to remember that not everyone in our healthcare system is Catholic. We are seeing these increasing secular healthcare deserts, and we need to make sure that while we honor our faith as individuals, we are not forcing that onto other people, which is all a lot of people ask for. I think there is generally nothing wrong with religious groups doing things like providing health care, so long as they are not forcing their morals onto the people they are providing health care to. And I think that's a very important distinction that we are rapidly losing because the Catholic hierarchy has gone off on this Christian nationalist bent that is trying to control everybody's lives, even to the objections of the actual Catholic faithful. I mean, it's like 90-odd% of Catholic women at some point in their life use birth control.
Right.
And you see a lot of times Catholic healthcare providers will kind of circumvent these rulings that say, hey, you can't prescribe contraception, et cetera, by saying, oh, well, it's not to prevent conception.
It's not contraception. It's
it's,
hormonal
regulation.
Yeah.
It's, women will still be able to get prescribed it after giving birth for hormonal regulation, or, folks who have periods, who have really, really bad periods are able to get it as a form of hormonal regulation. They just have to be like, but it's not to prevent conception. So I think we're going to see more and more a lot of this circumventing, because this unelected, completely radical religious group of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops is really heavily trying to control the Catholic healthcare system that has gone up exponentially in terms of eating up healthcare systems. I think it's 70% of acute healthcare beds in the United States are in a Catholic system.
Think about that. This is not right. Like, you can't overstate the influence of the Conference of Catholic Bishops on our healthcare system when so many hospital beds are in Catholic hospitals. Like, we're not talking about, small Catholic hospitals serving small Catholic communities. Like, these are huge hospital systems that happen to be owned by a Catholic healthcare system, and those systems are controlled in some of these areas of care that the Catholic Conference of Bishops has decided is important to their theology. And we're talking about wide swaths of care. We're talking about gender-affirming care and everything that falls under treating gender dysphoria, reproductive care and everything that falls under it. If the Catholic Conference of Bishops decides to take a position on IVF, that will affect what is available in Catholic hospitals with regard to assisted reproduction. They obviously are anti-abortion. That affects, what types of care or what types of life-saving care is available in Catholic hospitals if it involves any type of abortion care. It affects access to contraception. It affects end-of-life care. It affects so many things that the bishops take a theological, moral position on, but if you're a patient, you're just walking into your local St. Mary's hospital.
Right. And it might not even be called St. Mary's.
Right.
A lot of these hospitals are getting eaten up by the Catholic healthcare system, and they keep their, original name. I know that that's an issue that's being faced by my hometown hospital. There are talks about it getting eaten up by Catholic healthcare system because it can no longer afford really to operate on its own, but it will likely still be called Davies Community Hospital.
Right.
Like, you won't know.
Exactly. So as a patient in a community, you're just going to your local hospital trying to get the best care. And the care that's going to be available to you is dictated by a bunch of bishops who are not doctors, and their only concern in all of these areas that are so important to people's care, their only concern is their own narrow morality and theology. And it's scary because as patients, and oftentimes it's when you're a more vulnerable, more rural, more isolated population, you don't have access to better care, and you don't even know that the care that you have access to is subpar because it's dictated by a specific church. It's scary.
It is scary. And I think on that very scary note, we are going to transition to questions.
Yeah,
so you can all be scared with us.
Mm-hmm. Let's see what everyone else is scared about. Here we go. All right. Let's start with this. We spoke about PrEP drugs being potentially uninsured, right? Uncovered by insurance. Are there other health insurance roadblocks for those in the LGBTQ community that you know of in some of these other areas?
Well, I think gender-affirming care is very much one of the big ones. I think that access to gender-affirming care is going to be dictated by health insurance. We're already seeing that one of the routes legislators are taking is, they're using the abortion playbook, essentially, where they're like, okay, but it can't be covered by Medicaid, Medicare. Okay, federal dollars can't go to gender-affirming care. So even when these bans get pushed down, they take another route. They swing another bat, and they start making it financially inaccessible. So I think that's another big insurance-related piece that really goes into looking at LGBT-related healthcare is so many people get their healthcare through the government. So when you see all of these Christian nationalists, I mean, this is going to be a big part of Project 2025. If you go through Project 2025, you're going to see things like making sure that state-funded insurance can't cover these types of things so that it is not accessible to especially poor people. Because I think it is also still very similar to abortion, where abortion bans, for the most part, impact low-income people. They impact poor people. They impact the people who can't get on a plane and go to Canada or go to Mexico and get an abortion, which is the majority and the growing majority of Americans. Like, this is all a part of the goal, is to make it inaccessible to at least the majority of Americans. So we are definitely seeing those insurance-based routes as threats to LGBT healthcare.
Right. And these individual, religious employer-based challenges to insurance mandates are a big part of that project, right? It's like, oh, well, anywhere there are mandates that are making it so employers have to cover any of the care that can be considered reproductive or, supportive of LGBTQ patients, we're going to challenge that in court as religious employers.
And tying back to what we were just talking about with Catholic healthcare, there are Catholic insurance companies like Dean Health Insurance here in the Madison area. That was actually a big thing. Our local government used to provide employee health insurance through this Catholic health insurance provider. And they recently said when that contract runs out, we will be switching to a secular healthcare provider to ensure that our employees can still access birth control, gender-affirming care, etc. And again, think about that name, Dean. It's like Dean SSM.
Yeah.
Like, that does not say Catholic.
Right. You don't necessarily know until you're seeking, treatment for gender dysphoria, or you're seeking an abortion or whatever it is, that, oh, my insurer is Catholic. They don't cover this care. Or
like,
I'm
I cannot
emphasize
enough how intrinsically linked gender-affirming care, LGBT healthcare, and reproductive care are. You cannot talk about one without the other. I think in the entire course of my fellowship, my fellowship is almost over, that is the biggest lesson I have learned as someone who specializes in this intersection, who this is my entire life, is you cannot talk about reproductive health without talking about gender-affirming care, because it all comes to the same political opposition to bodily autonomy and forcing people they perceive to be as women into a certain bodily role.
Yes, absolutely. Well, here's a question sort of off that track. Is there a more than nominal amount of anti-LGBTQ discrimination by medical providers, doctors, nurses, providers in the system? In other words, what are the chances my doctor would be anti-LGBT, and if they were, how would that manifest itself in my health care? Would my care suffer? Any experience with
So
share?
I am actually incredibly lucky in that area personally, that when I started seeking out gender-affirming care, Indiana University, the student health center there, has a wonderful doctor who specializes in gender-affirming care, specializes in trans health care as a recognized expert on how to properly provide that care. So she was very wonderful when I first started HRT. And then when I moved to Wisconsin, I did have to be very intentional when searching for a primary care physician that's the person who does my HRT. And being like, outright, upfront, I am trans. I need someone who is capable of giving me proper gender-affirming care. And gender-affirming care ties into all of my other health care, my sexual health care, my reproductive health care, my chronic illnesses. I have an autoimmune disease that ties into HRT. So I was very lucky in that regard, but I know a ton of people who are not. You will see all of these barriers start to pop up that are kind of like masked as informed consent, where it's like, you need to be sure. You need to be really, really sure. You need to be really, really, really sure. And to an extent, that is important. One of the things I had to do was work very closely with my primary care, my therapist, and my psychiatrist to make sure that my mental health was in a place where, you're basically going through second puberty, where I could handle the emotional ups and downs. But a lot of times it takes the form of, if we just put all these barriers, you are going to give up.
Right.
There are also tons of wait lists. That is a huge issue. You know, there are usually like Google Docs and things in community spaces that go around that say, here are the doctors that won't give a massive barrier to you, you know, accessing this healthcare beyond what is reasonable. And the wait list for that is massively long. I mean, we know doctors that have accidentally become go-to gender-affirming care providers because they were like the one person in the area that showed themselves to be trans-friendly.
Yes.
And so word spreads like wildfire.
In the community.
And so I think it's less, you know, the way that manifests in healthcare is going to be, well, you need to wait.
Yeah.
Well, we need this. We need that. Or sometimes you're just going to have a doctor say, I don't do that. I don't think that's real. Here's, you know, a therapist who does something called gender exploratory therapy. And I think that that's something we're going to see now. And gender exploratory therapy sounds like a great thing, but it is essentially a form of therapy. It's conversion therapy.
Yes.
It is an anything but trans therapy. Madison Pauly at Mother Jones recently wrote a really excellent piece about the push for gender exploratory therapy, about the push that we're seeing in these conferences and amongst legislatures to mandate things like gender exploratory therapy before someone can access gender affirming care. So I think that will be another tactic that we see in medical transphobia, of them being like, okay, but you need to see this particular therapist. It can't be whatever therapist you were already seeing. You need to see this one, so that they will convince you and gaslight you into basically saying that you're not trans. And I think that that will be a major issue moving forward.
And again, we know how harmful conversion therapy has been on just, you know, LGBT youth. And so to see like the Christian anti-gay movement like seize on another form of conversion therapy is pretty unconscionable. But I think you're pointing out something important, which is when we're talking about these barriers to healthcare for our LGBTQ allies, we're not just talking about these like lawsuits and legislative bans. Like there are so many soft barriers that exist that, you know, many of us don't understand or don't perceive, that make it hard enough to access adequate care.
And non-malicious barriers. Like, I think, you know, I have friends who have recently graduated from medical school or currently doing residency, and they do get more training now on how to treat trans patients. That competency is really starting to grow and starting to become a priority. Now, I do wonder if in the anti-CRT, the anti-DEI era of policing curriculum, if that will start to become an issue. But you see people who are really getting educated on it. But think about, you know, my childhood doctor was probably in like his 60s. Like, think about especially those small town doctors where there's like one guy and he's like, yeah, he delivered your mom, he delivered you. Like, it's always like, there's always in these rural small towns, like just the doctor.
Yeah.
And, you know, that I think is also going to become an issue, and that's like a non-malicious barrier.
That's just a lack of competency.
Why would you need specific healthcare? Why do you need specific types of testing? You know, why do I need to be very intentional about how I phrase things in your chart and when I'm prescribing things so that your insurance will cover it? You know, in order to get gel testosterone, my healthcare provider had to put in my chart that I have a needle phobia, and we had to fight to get the prior authorization in order for me to get that. And so do doctors have that training on trans issues where it's just a soft barrier that you don't even think about because that training doesn't exist?
Right. All right. Well, here's a couple more questions. What laws can either be implemented or removed to help LGBTQ plus persons get the health care they need? Removed, obviously we've covered. These healthcare bans are literally unlawful and unconscionable and should be repealed and lobbied against. But what could be, RFRA would be a good one, which is elevating the religious rights of everyone in society and subordinating the rights of minorities, women, LGBTQ people, and making it so that their access to services and prescriptions and things like that can be, subordinated, and the rights of their employers, the religious rights of their employers, are supreme. That's how RFRA has operated, and it's wrong and should be repealed. What about laws that could be implemented to protect LGBTQ plus healthcare? Are bills introduced that would be something like the making Roe versus Wade into a statute,
Right.
That kind of a
So
thing.
we're seeing, so states are codifying things like abortion access, and I think you can do something very similar with gender-affirming care. Again, they can use the abortion playbook, so can we.
Yeah.
We can swing the same bat. And this is kind of getting into legislative type of stuff, but I think codifying the right to access to gender-affirming care, we see states like Minnesota, for example, saying we are a trans refuge state. If you need to come here to access health care, we are going to do everything in our power to make sure that states that are trying to ban even going out of state, which they've also done with abortion,
Yes.
Cannot get to you. We will not extradite people. We will not, interfere and support states that say there's a divorced couple and someone takes their child out of state and they disagree about trans issues. They take their child to Minnesota to be able to get gender-affirming care. They will not help support, a parent using these laws to then get custody of that child, or the criminalization. Tennessee, just like we're talking, there's another ban in Tennessee right now that makes it a felony to take a minor out of state to get gender-affirming care.
It's absolutely crazy.
Putting laws in place in the basically other 50% of the states that say, you have a right to access this care. We are not going to help other states that try to prosecute this type of care. That is going to be very important. And I think one of the things that I still, 25%, I'd say, believe in the courts. There is still a part of me that believes in the power of the judicial system, but I think we became overly reliant on it for access to civil rights. I think that was the huge mistake we made when it came to things like abortion, and we're now seeing the fallout of that. So really taking the effort to just codify these things into law, get it on the books, get it written down, so that a single court case can't overturn decades of healthcare rights.
Exactly.
I think also establishing things, because right now the majority of the bills are focused on minors. Some of them try to get up to age 26, but for the most part, it's focused on minors. Establishing something that allows children to have a level, like a healthcare bill of rights, to have a level of bodily autonomy. Of course, parents should be involved in healthcare decisions, but I don't want to make the parental rights argument, because that just solidifies the other side's parental rights argument. I think there needs to be a balance that allows children who are mature enough, who are deemed mature enough, to access gender-affirming care the same way that many states will allow minors to access an abortion without parental consent through a judicial process.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I'll end on this question because it's about action. I feel helpless over a lot of this. Is there anything the average person can do? Call representatives, call our insurance carriers. Would it even do any good?
Yes. Yes. Welcome to Kat Grant's rant that happens every time I'm on the show. Every single time I give this rant. You have the power. It is not hopeless. We are not in the end game by any means. This fight is not over. So yes, number one, get in contact, especially with your state level representative. Your state level representative is going to be thrilled to hear from you. They're going to be thrilled to hear from anyone. No one talks about state level, elected officials. So get in touch with their office, especially make a phone call. That is the best thing you can do. I hate calling people. I get it. I'm that generation of phone anxiety. If I can send a text, I will send a text. But phone calls are very much the most effective way to get through. If you can schedule an in-person meeting, even better. Get that face-to-face, put a face to these issues. Make it not just this amorphous blob of trans people. Make it someone who votes, who is in their constituency. If your state representative is someone who has made a very hardline stance, who you don't think, okay, maybe this particular representative you can't get through to, vote for somebody else. I don't care, what your stance on voting in the upcoming election is, but vote in at least your state and local elections. Vote and make your opinion known. That is one of the most important things we can still do. Again, not a lost cause.
These bans are happening at the state level, so that is a very important place to register the fact that you exist.
Yes.
And you're a constituent. And Sacha Buchert said this on our podcast from Lambda, which is, if you're not talking to them, someone else is about these, anti-trans healthcare bills or whatever. It's the Christian nationalists that are making phone calls.
Right.
Someone's talking to them about these bills. It's not many people, but
right.
So all the more reason why it needs to be trans allies and members of the community.
And if you're not happy with who is running, here's a shocking thing. You can run for something. You can run for school board, county council, state rep. You can do that. You are allowed to do that. That is your right as an American. Run for something. Contact your local, whatever party you want to run under, especially if you are a young person. Political parties are desperate for young people to run for things. Do it. A lot of state legislatures, that's a part-time job. That is not a full-time job. You can still continue to do your full-time job and be a state legislator. That is completely doable. So you absolutely can run for something. In terms of calling your insurance company, maybe a little less effective, but we live in a capitalist society. So you do still have the power of the purse. I think insurance is a little difficult because a lot of us get our insurance through our employer. But you can talk to your HR department and be like, hey, did you know that our insurance provider is a Catholic provider that might prevent us from getting, reproductive care, gender-affirming care, et cetera? Maybe it's time to look at renegotiating those contracts. Maybe it's time to look at, when this contract runs up, getting a new insurance provider. It might, if you do have the power to choose your insurance provider, definitely call and check and say, hey, if I need XYZ type of healthcare, is that going to be covered, or are you going to say for religious reasons, no, we will not cover this? And then follow that up with, okay, well, if that's the case and that doesn't change, you have lost me as a customer and you're going to lose a lot of customers. The more that these businesses hear that this is going to be a problem for their bottom line, the more likely they are that they are going to change. Because at the end of the day, these businesses do not care about people. They care about money.
Yes. Yeah, and we'll see that in the prep space too, I think. That will ultimately be a part of the solution forward. Well, that is going to do it for today. And thank you so much, Kat, for talking about this with me.
Always. Love to be here.
So that wraps our episode for FFRF's Ask an Atheist this week, but do not miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. This week, FFRF co-presidents Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker speak with Kara Fitzpatrick, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Death of Public Schools: How Conservatives Won the War Over Education in America. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
We also have a lot of fun and irreverent merch available on our online store. There's t-shirts, bumper stickers, pins, coffee mugs, books, and so much more. You can check all that out by visiting ffrf.org/shop. And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're already a member, thank you. And if not, please join us. We will see you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.